Picture this. You're the most powerful man in Europe, commanding armies across continents and deciding the fate of millions with a single word. Now imagine that you can't even take a piss without an audience of 200 people watching your every move. Welcome to the grotesque reality of Louis XIV's daily existence, where absolute power came with absolutely zero privacy. Every morning at precisely 8 a.m., the doors to the Sun King's bedchamber would swing open like the curtains of a twisted theater. What followed wasn't a royal awakening, but a carefully choreographed human zoo exhibition. Dozens of French nobles would crowd into the room, literally fighting each other for the privilege of watching their king urinate into a golden chamber pot. But here's where it gets truly insane. These weren't just casual observers. There was an official hierarchy of who could watch what bodily function. The Duke of Orleans had the honor of holding the royal shirt. The Count of Toulouse was permitted to hand the king his underwear. And the most prestigious position of all? The gentleman who got to hold the chamber pot while Louis XIV relieved himself. The morning ritual took over 2 hours, not because the king was slow, but because every single action required a specific noble to perform a specific task in a specific order. Putting on his stockings involved 3 different courtiers. Washing his hands required a ceremonial parade of towel holders. Even scratching his nose had to be done through an intermediary because touching the royal person directly was forbidden. Imagine being so trapped by your own power that you couldn't perform the most basic human functions without turning them into state ceremonies. Louis XIV had created a system so rigid that he became its prisoner. The man who claimed divine right to rule couldn't even choose when to eat breakfast without consulting the official court schedule. The psychological toll was devastating. Foreign ambassadors reported that the French king appeared constantly on edge, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for escape from his golden cage. But there was no escape. The king had painted himself into a corner of his own making, surrounded by hundreds of people who treated him like a living god, while simultaneously robbing him of his humanity. But the morning privacy violations were nothing compared to what happened when the king needed to defecate. The ritual surrounding the royal bowel movements would make a medical examination look casual. And if you think watching the king urinate was degrading, wait until you hear about the daily bloodletting sessions that were about to drain the life out of the most powerful man in Europe. What if I told you that the most advanced doctors in Europe were slowly murdering their patient, and their patient was begging them to do it faster? Meet the royal physicians of Louis XIV, men who turned healing into torture and called it medicine. Every single morning, after the grotesque public awakening ceremony, came something even more horrifying: the daily bloodletting. Royal doctors believed that the king's blood became corrupted overnight and needed to be drained regularly to maintain his divine health. They weren't just taking a small sample. These medical butchers were removing pints of blood from the Sun King's body on a daily basis. The process was medieval in its brutality. Royal physicians would slice open veins in the king's arms, legs, and sometimes even his forehead, allowing blood to pour into ornate silver bowls. Louis XIV would sit there, growing paler by the minute, while doctors congratulated themselves on removing the poison from his royal system. The irony is staggering. They were literally bleeding the life out of the most powerful man in Europe while claiming to preserve it. But here's where the medical insanity reached truly disturbing levels. When regular bloodletting wasn't enough, royal doctors escalated to cupping. They would heat glass cups and place them on the king's skin, creating suction that pulled blood to the surface. Louis XIV's body became covered in circular bruises and open wounds from this repeated torture. His own courtiers reported that the king looked like he'd been attacked by some bizarre medieval torture device, which, technically, he had. The psychological effects were just as devastating as the physical ones. Louis XIV became obsessed with his blood, believing that its color and consistency determined his fitness to rule. Doctors would examine each bowl of extracted blood like fortune tellers reading tea leaves, declaring the king's mood, health, and even military prospects based on how thick or thin his blood appeared that day. The most disturbing part was that Louis XIV actually requested these sessions. Years of medical propaganda had convinced him that feeling weak and dizzy after bloodletting was proof that the treatment was working. The king would literally summon his doctors and beg them to drain more blood when he felt unwell, not understanding that the bloodletting was causing his symptoms, not curing them. Palace records show that in some months, royal physicians removed over 20 pints of blood from the king's body. To put that in perspective, the average human body contains only about 10 pints of blood total. Louis XIV was being medically drained and refilled like some kind of human oil change, and the constant blood loss left him chronically anemic, pale as a corpse, and increasingly unable to think clearly. Foreign ambassadors noted that the Sun King appeared to be slowly fading away, his legendary energy replaced by a ghostly lethargy that made him seem more dead than alive. But the royal doctors weren't finished with their medical torture. They had an even more humiliating treatment waiting in the wings, one that would turn the most powerful throne room in Europe into a public bathroom. If you thought daily bloodletting was the peak of medical humiliation, you haven't heard about the enema obsession that turned the Sun King's rectum into a public spectacle. French royal doctors believed that the key to divine health lay not in the blood, but in the bowels, and they were determined to clean out their king whether he liked it or not. Louis XIV received between 3 to 5 enemas per day, administered not in private medical chambers, but in full view of his court. Picture this: the most powerful monarch in Europe bent over a specially designed chair while royal physicians inserted enormous brass and ivory tubes into his anus, pumping gallons of various liquids into his intestines, while dozens of nobles stood around making polite conversation. The enema apparatus itself was a grotesque contraption that looked more like a medieval torture device than medical equipment. The tubes were thick, unlubricated, and often inserted with such force that the king would cry out in pain. But royal etiquette demanded that he endure this violation with dignity, so Louis XIV would grip the arms of his enema chair, his knuckles white with tension, while trying to maintain the composure expected of a divine ruler. The substances pumped into the royal rectum were as bizarre as the procedure itself. Royal physicians would mix wine, herbs, animal bile, and sometimes even ground pearls into the enema solutions, believing these ingredients would purify the king from within. The wine enemas were particularly brutal because alcohol in the rectum causes intense burning and cramping. Louis XIV would writhe in agony while doctors assured him that the pain meant the treatment was working. But here's where it gets truly degrading. After each enema session, the king would be forced to evacuate his bowels in front of the same audience that had watched the insertion. Noble courtiers would stand around making idle chatter while their monarch expelled the enema mixture, along with whatever contents his intestines had originally contained. The smell was reportedly so overwhelming that some visitors would excuse themselves to vomit in the palace corridors. The psychological damage was immense. Louis XIV began to associate his most private bodily functions with public performance. He couldn't have a normal bowel movement without anxiety, knowing that every aspect of his digestive system had become a matter of state concern. Palace physicians kept detailed records of the king's feces, analyzing color, consistency, and odor as indicators of royal health. The enema schedule became so rigid that state meetings were arranged around the king's intestinal treatments. Foreign ambassadors learned to time their visits to avoid the daily evacuation sessions, though the sound of the royal purging could often be heard echoing through the palace corridors. Some diplomatic letters from the period actually reference delays in negotiations due to His Majesty's medical necessities. What makes this even more disturbing is that Louis XIV began to believe these humiliating procedures were evidence of his divine nature. Only a king chosen by God, he reasoned, would receive such elaborate medical attention. The enemas weren't degrading him. They were proving his special status. This twisted logic would soon be tested when a much more serious medical condition developed, one that would make the daily enemas seem like gentle massage therapy. In 1686, what started as minor discomfort during the royal enema sessions evolved into something far more sinister. Louis XIV developed an anal fistula, essentially a tunnel of infected tissue that connected his rectum to the surface of his skin. What began as the Sun King's minor medical inconvenience was about to become a rotting, pus-filled nightmare that would nearly kill the most powerful man in Europe. The fistula began as a small, painful lump near the king's anus, probably caused by the repeated trauma from those massive enema tubes. But royal physicians, trained in medieval medical theory rather than actual healing, decided the best treatment was to probe the infected area with metal instruments, essentially turning a minor infection into a gaping wound that would never properly heal. The smell became unbearable first. Courtiers reported that approaching the king meant enduring a stench so foul it made their eyes water. The infected fistula was literally rotting inside Louis XIV's body, producing a constant flow of pus and decaying tissue that soaked through his elaborate royal garments. Palace laundresses began refusing to clean the king's undergarments without extra pay and multiple perfume treatments. But the royal doctors weren't finished. They decided that the fistula needed to be opened to allow proper drainage. Without any anesthesia, without any understanding of infection or hygiene, they began cutting into the king's infected flesh with crude surgical instruments. The Sun King would grip the sides of his chair, screaming in agony, while physicians sliced deeper into his rotting tissue, creating an even larger wound. The operation, performed in November 1686, was conducted in front of the usual audience of nobles and physicians. Louis XIV was positioned face down on a specially constructed table, while the royal surgeon, Charles-François Félix, used a scalpel to cut away infected tissue and create better drainage for the pus. The king's screams could be heard throughout the palace, but royal etiquette demanded that the procedure continue until completion. The wound never properly healed. For the remaining 29 years of his life, Louis XIV lived with an open, draining sore near his anus that constantly leaked infected fluid. He had to wear specially designed padding to absorb the continuous discharge, and the smell of rotting flesh became his permanent companion. The man who had once commanded respect through his presence now cleared rooms simply by walking into them. The psychological impact was devastating. The Sun King, who had built his entire identity around physical magnificence and divine perfection, was literally rotting from the inside out. He became increasingly reclusive, avoiding public appearances and limiting his interactions to essential state business. The confident, charismatic monarch was being replaced by a bitter, pain-racked invalid who smelled like a walking corpse. But the fistula was just the beginning of Louis XIV's medical nightmare. Royal physicians, emboldened by their success in treating the anal infection, were about to move on to an even more devastating target, the king's mouth. What happened next would turn the Sun King's face into a medical horror show that would make his rotting rectum seem like a minor inconvenience. By 1682, the Sun King's dental problems had become a royal crisis that would transform his face into a medical catastrophe. What started as routine tooth decay escalated into one of the most brutal medical procedures ever performed on a living monarch, turning Louis XIV's mouth into a gaping wound that would never properly heal. The king's teeth had been rotting for years, a common problem in an era when sugar was a luxury that royalty consumed in massive quantities. But instead of treating the decay gradually, royal physicians decided on a radical solution. They would remove every single tooth in Louis XIV's head in one session. Without anesthesia, without proper surgical tools, without any understanding of the carnage they were about to unleash. The procedure took place in the royal bedchamber, with the usual audience of nobles and medical officials watching. Louis XIV was strapped to a chair while royal surgeons used crude metal pliers to wrench each tooth from his skull. The king's screams echoed through Versailles as physicians twisted and pulled, sometimes breaking teeth at the root and leaving infected fragments embedded in his gums. But the medical butchery didn't stop with tooth extraction. Royal surgeons, working with instruments that resembled torture devices more than medical tools, accidentally punctured through the roof of the king's mouth into his nasal cavity. They had literally created a hole between Louis XIV's mouth and nose, a medical disaster that would plague him for the rest of his life. The immediate aftermath was horrifying. The Sun King couldn't eat solid food without it falling out of the hole in his palate. When he attempted to drink, liquid would pour from his nose. His speech became unintelligible, a wet mumbling that even his closest advisors struggled to understand. The man whose words had once commanded armies could barely communicate his basic needs. The infection that followed was even worse. The open wound in his palate became a breeding ground for bacteria, creating a constant source of putrid discharge that mixed saliva, blood, and pus. The smell emanating from the king's mouth was so foul that courtiers would step back when he spoke, and many began carrying perfumed handkerchiefs whenever they anticipated royal conversation. Eating became a public humiliation. The Sun King, once famous for his elaborate dining ceremonies, now had to consume only liquid foods that wouldn't leak through the hole in his palate. Even then, the process was messy and degrading, with food constantly dripping from his nose and mouth. Palace servants were assigned to stand behind his chair with towels to constantly wipe away the discharge. The psychological destruction was complete. Louis XIV had built his entire royal identity around magnificent public appearances and commanding oratory. Now he looked like a toothless old man with a constantly drooling mouth, and he sounded like he was speaking through a mouthful of mud. The divine king had been reduced to a medical curiosity that horrified everyone who encountered him. Royal physicians, rather than admitting their catastrophic failure, doubled down on their treatments. They began stuffing the hole in the king's palate with various materials: cloth soaked in wine, ground herbs, even small pieces of gold, believing these would promote healing. Instead, they created additional infection sites that made the king's condition even worse. But Louis XIV's medical nightmare was far from over. The combination of chronic blood loss, infected wounds, and constant pain was about to trigger the final phase of his physical collapse. The Sun King was entering his death spiral, and it would be more grotesque than anyone could have imagined. By August 1715, the Sun King had become a walking corpse who refused to die. After decades of medical torture disguised as treatment, Louis XIV's body was shutting down in the most grotesque way possible. What followed was an agonizing death that lasted for weeks, turning the Palace of Versailles into a charnel house where the smell of royal decay filled every corridor. The gangrene started in his leg, probably triggered by his diabetes and the constant infections from his previous medical treatments. But this wasn't ordinary gangrene. The rotting flesh spread with horrifying speed, turning the king's leg black and filling the air with the sweet, nauseating smell of decomposing tissue. Palace physicians, true to form, decided the best treatment was to burn the infected flesh with red-hot irons. The cauterization sessions were medieval torture disguised as medicine. Royal doctors would heat metal rods until they glowed cherry red, then press them directly against the king's rotting flesh. The sound of sizzling skin and the smoke from burning tissue filled the royal bedchamber while Louis XIV screamed in agony. The smell was so overwhelming that several courtiers vomited during the procedures, but royal etiquette demanded they remain present. As the gangrene spread, so did the stench. The Sun King's body was literally rotting while he was still alive, and the odor became so unbearable that palace servants began drawing straws to determine who would attend to him. Even with the windows open and perfumes burning constantly, the smell of decaying royal flesh permeated the entire palace. Visitors reported being able to detect the king's condition from several rooms away. But the most disturbing aspect was Louis XIV's mental state during his final weeks. Decades of medical abuse had left him convinced that his suffering was divinely ordained, that a true king must endure pain to prove his worth. Even as his body fell apart, he continued to hold court, forcing nobles to pretend that the rotting, delirious man before them was still the magnificent Sun King. The final days were a horror show of bodily functions gone wrong. The king simultaneously vomited blood while evacuating his bowels uncontrollably. His infected fistula, still draining after nearly 30 years, had become one of many open wounds leaking pus and rotted tissue. Royal physicians continued their bloodletting treatments even as the king lay dying, removing precious blood from a body that was already shutting down. On September 1st, 1715, Louis XIV finally died, probably more from medical treatment than from his actual diseases. But even death couldn't end the grotesque spectacle. Within hours, his body began decomposing so rapidly that the planned funeral had to be moved up. The smell of the royal corpse became so unbearable that embalmers refused to work on it without extra pay and protective clothing. The autopsy revealed the full horror of what 77 years of royal medicine had done to the Sun King. His heart was found to be less than half normal size, probably from decades of bloodletting. His digestive system was a mess of scar tissue and infections. Most shocking of all, the hole in his palate had never healed, and his nasal cavity was filled with infected tissue that had been rotting for over 30 years. The man who had claimed to be the Sun King, chosen by God to rule over millions, died as a rotting, stinking corpse whose own servants could barely stand to be near him. His elaborate medical treatments, designed to preserve divine health, had turned him into a walking advertisement for the dangers of unchecked power and medical ignorance. The absolute monarch had become absolutely pathetic, and his death was less a tragedy than a mercy for everyone who had been forced to witness his decades-long medical nightmare. France celebrated his death with barely concealed relief. The Sun King was finally setting, and the smell of his decay could finally be buried with him.